Okay, welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. So if you move on to slides 5 and 6, you can see that on slide 5 there's a script from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which gives you some of the ideas in the scene. And what you can see here, I think, is two kinds of class-related joke, among many others, and I'm sure we'll talk about those in the seminar. One of these is a joke about ignorant peasants, if you like. So ignorant and uneducated people who are supposedly believing in witchcraft because they're a bit thick, to be quite honest. So the Michael Palin character, among others, is one of the ones roaring, burn her, burn her. The John Cleese character says, well, she turned me into a newt, which is clearly not true because he's not a newt anymore. And then he says, well, I got better. What does that even mean? We're supposed to laugh at these people because they're ignorant peasants. They're dressed as medieval peasants and they're saying ignorant things. And so we, the superior 20th century viewer, this is a film from the 1970s, look down on these people and think, well, we would never believe that. We would never think that. That would never be something that we would invest in, this belief in witchcraft. Except, of course, a lot of modern people do. And I think if we're honest, a lot of us have beliefs in things that are semi-magical, things like chance and fate and horoscopes and those kind of ideas. You know, sometimes we do find ourselves stumbling over these things in our minds, and certainly we know that right across the world people do still believe in witchcraft, including here in Britain. So I think we shouldn't look down on these ignorant peasants. But the other thing we shouldn't do is fall into the trap of making the other joke that the Monty Python team make, which is about ignorant intellectuals. Clever posh people who think they know a lot, like in these scenes, King Arthur and his knights, and actually know nothing at all. So we see the knight here engaging with the peasants and trying to work out what's going on, but he doesn't lead them towards the path of thinking that the woman accused of witchcraft is in fact innocent. Instead, he encourages them in her belief, but he gives them a whole range of other different reasons why she might be a witch. He helps them to conclude that witches are made of wood, for example, which is clearly nonsense. But he is a demonologist. He is a target here because he is a demonologist. He is an ignorant person even though he is a highly educated person. And demonologists are often seen in this way by historians as well as the writers of comedy films. These are seen as people who made a terrible mistake, but did so because they were prejudiced, perhaps in religious or sectarian terms, perhaps in terms of gender, perhaps in terms of nationality. They made mistakes because they were deluded by their own self-importance. They made mistakes because they drew false conclusions and regarded themselves as massively knowledgeable when they should not have done. So these are the other targets here, I think. And if you move on to the next slide, you can start to see that this isn't true. That these people, the demonologists, were part of a much wider substratum of society, including here top artists like Hans Baldwin Green, one of the top woodcut artists of his time, and also one of the top painters, somebody who's really well educated, somebody who's highly skilled in what he did, and yet produced images of witches, produced images of here, the witches' Sabbath. Witches are thought to have these big meetings, as I'm sure you'll have started to discover, where they meet together and they do all sorts of unspeakable things. And Baldwin Green reproduces this in his illustrations, seen here from 1510. We have these women here engaging in witchcraft activities. There are 4 of them, but there are also some other creatures in the scene here. One of them is, of course, the flying goat, you know, as you do. There's the moment when we laugh. But also the moment when I think we have to think, why do they think this? Why do they think this? It's not because they're stupid, is it? It's not because they're ill-educated. These are some of the most highly educated people of their time. And they're not idiots. People in the past are not idiots. They may have done the wrong things, as we still do today, quite frequently. They're not fools. So why do they think what they think? And they think goats can fly because the goat is the devil, because the devil is an airy spirit. His body is made of something like air, some kind of ether, and he can therefore fly through the air because he's light, because he can do magical things, because he's a supernatural or preternatural being, and he can do what he wants with the physical substances around him. So the devil can fly, and the witch can fly on the back of the devil, as we see her doing here. She's holding a kind of long pitchfork thing, and she's also holding within that a jar, out of which, in common with the jar that the other three women are grouped around, some form of magical smoke or substance, perhaps a spell of some kind, is flying. So we see them producing this magic, and we see partly how they are doing it. They are doing it with the aid of the devil / goat. Also, behind one of the witches, the woman on the right of the picture as you look at it, she has a cat behind her. So she has a cat familiar. She has somebody working with her who is perhaps not the main devil, but a little devil who works with her. And this creature too is facilitating their magic. Note also that they're all women, however. There are no male witches in this scene. The women's bodily power, the power of their nakedness, the power of their bodies seems to be working the magic in some way. Their femininity is something powerful. And Baldwin Green gives us all of these images to help us think about why witchcraft works, why he thinks, along with the demonologists of his time, that these women are indeed witches. And they use other things too. They use the natural world. There's a tree here. There are various stakes and sticks here. There are domestic implements. And there are skulls. There are images of parts of dead bodies here, animal bodies that they use in their work. All these things medieval and early modern people thought could be brought together to make magic. And magic was part of a continuum from the natural world. It was not something set apart in the way that we might think. It was part of that continuum between the natural world, the material world, and the spiritual world, all of which could work together to transform things. If you go on to the next slide, you can see the ways in which English woodcut artists thought about this. Note, they're a lot cruder. The German artists, the Flemish artists of this period were much better artists. They were much better woodcutters than their English counterparts. But nevertheless, here are a series of English images of witchcraft. And these are from the titles of news pamphlets. So these are the tabloid presses of their time. These are the red top newspapers. And we can see here that there are witches feeding familiars. So the idea of the familiar is far less common on the European continent than it is in England. In England, and you can see that in all of these images, all witches are thought to have some kind of animal familiar. If they don't have an animal familiar, a little devil who works with them to do their magic, then there must be something wrong with them. Perhaps they're not witches at all. They seem to be feeding these familiars. They seem to be interacting with them in a variety of ways. In the lower image on the right, a familiar, something like an owl, is sitting on the shoulder of one of the witches, while a rat gambols around her feet, and there is a cat sandwiched in between her and the next woman to her. If we look to the left, we can see the named witch Joan Prentice, a woman who was tried and executed at Chelmsford in 1589. She has a ferret, and yes, it is a ferret, the text tells us so. I'm not sure you necessarily know from the image. She has a ferret who she refers to as her bid, she calls it bid, climbing up, and this ferret is trying to bite her on the face. And it's doing that because it's going to suck blood out of her body. Witches were thought to nourish their familiar spirits on blood. But in the upper image on the left, we can also see that the witch is feeding her familiar spirits, which seem to live in a box in her house, on some kind of gruel or milk or something that she's spooning out of a dish. So just as she would feed a child. And these familiar spirits are perhaps toads, but also the one in the foreground seems to be some kind of hybrid creature, something a cross between some sort of little eared fluffy animal, or perhaps some kind of reptilian snouted animal with ears, and something which has a long animal body and a tail which is a bit like the body of the toads, but yet not quite. We have once again this idea that there is a continuum of the natural and the supernatural, the preternatural, and that the natural can turn very easily into the unnatural, the very strange. All these terms are mixed up in the early modern and medieval minds, and people really don't know what to imagine about how witches do their magic. But in England in particular, they do believe that animal familiars have a lot to do with this, and when you get newspaper accounts of witches, you often get discussion of their familiars too. If you move on to the next slide then, I have another short exercise for you, and this is about visual culture. This is about getting you familiar with the visual images of witches that people like Shakespeare would have been familiar with, and the other English writers, and when we come on to them, the other American writers on the module would have been familiar with. Here are two woodcut illustrations from a slightly later period. These are mid-17th century ones. One of them features Matthew Hopkins, the famous Witchfinder General. Go and look him up, he's really interesting. And of course they both have witches' familiars in them, birds in the one and all kinds of strange creatures in the other one. I'd like you to have a look at the article in the link here, and I'd like you to pick an image from that article. It can be one of the ones on this slide, or it can be something else from the article. And think about the ways that witches are being depicted in visual culture by highly skilled people who are often fairly highly educated too, a bit like our demonologists, but here we're dealing with visual artists. How did they imagine witches looked? What kind of people are the witches in the illustrations? What sort of activities are they getting up to? And who else is in the picture with them? Sometimes there are even demonologists in the picture with them. Matthew Hopkins, for example, was a theorist of how witchcraft worked, and he wrote his own account of it. So you might also want to think about how demonologists are depicted. When we're not laughing at them, as we are with the Monty Python team, what else are we thinking about them?